Hello dear students, I'm Dr. Madhuri Goswami. Welcome to this lesson that is a part 4 in the series of the lessons on translation from Hindi to English and English to Hindi. But in this lesson, we will study or we will come to know about 10 advanced tips for translation. To avoid common pitfalls, there are some general guidelines that you should keep in your mind when you are translating from the source language to the target language. Before we begin the lesson, before we get into the lesson, let's understand what is a source language and what is a target language. Suppose you are translating from English to Hindi. In this case, English is the source language and Hindi is the target language. But if you are doing vice versa, you are doing translation from or you are translating from Hindi to English, then Hindi is here your source language and English is your target language. Why I'm explaining all these terms here? Because in this lesson, I'm going to use these terms. So I'm clearing it out to you. What are these languages? Dear students, this is the first step which you should keep in your mind when you are going to write for translation. Sometimes you need to write for translation and sometimes you need to translate. So in this lesson, we are talking the tips which you should remember when you are writing for translation and especially in English. For this, the first step that is keep sentences brief. If you are writing the stuff, the material that should be or that will be translated by someone else, then you should keep your sentences brief. Why so? For increased comprehension and simpler translations. What are these two terms indicating? These two terms indicate that the better understanding of the stuff, of the material that you are writing. Aim for about 20 words or less in a sentence. That will definitely boost the readability and comprehension. So when you write down, just ask yourself, what's truly important? How can I simplify what I want to say? Reading sentences aloud helps to keep them short and sweet. For example, if you didn't write the material but are able to edit it before translation, do so. Keep the individual thoughts and sentences as brief as possible. The second tip is use standard English word order wherever possible. Dear students, I have already prepared some video lessons on basic sentence patterns in English, and in that video you will come to know about those basic sentence patterns. So you should follow that standard word order that is accepted in English. This generally means a subject, verb, and object with associated modifiers. Ensure correct grammatical structure and proper punctuation. So there should be the use of appropriate punctuation marks when you are writing, because if it's missing, then your meaning will be lost. Apart from that, just have a proofreading also. This includes checking the basics because mistakes can travel from source language to target languages. Translators often find and flag source errors, but that shouldn't be replaced proofreading your text for spelling and grammar. Dear students, when you are writing for translation, when the stuff is going to be translated, then please avoid long noun strings. What is this long noun strings? Means nouns in which you use lots of words to describe it and to explain it. Because long noun strings can lead to misinterpretation of the original meaning of that sentence. When connecting elements are omitted from noun strings, readers must infer the relationship between the words. If you have to read a sentence several times to understand it, chances are that there will be further complications when it's translated into another language. When this happens, we tend to see misinterpretation of the original meaning or a translation that appears too literal. The fourth tip is use just one term to identify a single concept. Dear students, it always not impressive to use synonyms for one word because synonyms get in the way of clarity. Write the same thing the same way every time you write it. Finding different ways to write a single concept will not only affect the overall consistency of translation, but it will also reduce the related translation memory leverage. This can lead to decreased quality, increased cost, and increased turnaround. Now, what does this word leverage mean? That is maximum advantage. So, just to make your text impressive, don't use so many words or synonyms for single term. If there is a single concept, then try to use one term to identify it. This will add clarity to your writing. The fifth suggestion or tip is to avoid humor. It's better to avoid humor, to skip the jokes, because it rarely translates with equivalency. Just as certain words may not translate smoothly from one language to the next, humor and sarcasm often get lost or confused. The same thing goes with jargon, regional phrases, or metaphors. How this? Let me explain it further. Expressions are not always universally understood or appreciated. They just don't translate. How? In some cases, what sounds like a joke could even get translated into something offensive. So try to avoid humor and jokes in your writing that you are writing for translation. If you can edit the content that you are planning to translate, get rid of the jokes or take the time to let a speaker who understands both languages go through and adjust the content so that the jokes make sense in the translation. Dear students, if you are writing something for translation and you are supposed to use some dates in that, then be clear with the international date formats because across the globe we have different kinds of date formats. For example, in the USA or America, the month comes first, followed by the day and ending with the year. But in our country, India, we have the day, then it's followed by the month and then the year. So it might be confusing at various times, so be clear about that. Just check the target language's origin place. But in other languages, we cannot say that the same order is followed. Many countries and languages throughout the world write the day first, followed by the month and then the year. So if we write 10 to 18, it might be February 10 to 18, and somewhere it might be October 2nd, 2018. So when dates are written out, the day is still first and the comma is dropped like 2nd October 2018. So what's the solution? The solution is that the safest choice to spell out the name of the month using an abbreviation for the month is fine if space is limited. The seventh tip is use relative pronouns like that and which. Even if you don't need them, they may improve understanding. How come this? The software that he licensed expires tomorrow is clearer than the software he licensed expires tomorrow. So it's good to check the pronouns have been included rather than assumed because it might get to misconception or confusion. If you will not use this relative pronoun that and which, your readers might get confused that what are you talking about? So it will give the clarity and it will improve the understanding. The suggestion number 8 is use the active voice rather than the passive voice. It's not that always use the active voice. Wherever it's required, you can use the passive voice. Why we should use the active voice rather than the passive voice? Because it's more direct, better understood, and easier to translate. Words like was and by may indicate that a passive voice is used. For example, the software was upgraded by the user. This is the passive voice. And the active voice, we can say, the user upgraded the software. So the second example is simpler and easier to translate. Or we can say passive voice or voice that describes events that have already happened don't always translate correctly between languages. So that it might be confusing. So you should use active voice, make it active rather than the passive. Here comes the ninth tip or suggestion. Avoid extensive use of phrasal verbs. What is a phrasal verb? A phrasal verb is a verb that contains a verb form with one or more articles. They tend to complicate translations. For example, use met rather than ran into. Phrasal verbs often have multiple meanings and are less formal. As your writing is a formal part, so don't use phrasal verbs a lot. Be on the lookout for 2 or 3 word verbs. I was trying to think of this in relation to another language, but I guess that a phrasal verb such as doesn't exist in other languages grammar also, so it's better to avoid phrasal verbs. This is the last but not the least suggestion or tip that you should keep in your mind when you're writing something for translation. That is to understand language and cultural differences. You know, jokes aren't the only things that can get lost in translation. Clichés are also tough to translate and will likely lose their meaning and instead sounding odd or out of place to your native readers. Because some words may not even have direct translations or they translate to words that do not mean the same thing. For instance, there are several words in English that cannot be translated into Hindi, and there are several words in Hindi that cannot be translated into English. If you try to translate, the meaning is lost. So, when translating from one language to another, a phrase that was intended to mean that something, but it's not clearly understood by the reader when it's translated from the source language to the target language. Apart from these suggestions, these 10 advanced tips, there is one more suggestion, that is to make sure that it fits the space. Means what you are going to write, that text is often shorter than the other languages. So just keep in your mind that there should be sufficient space that is required for the expansion from the source language to the target language. So dear students, in this lesson, we have seen those 10 advanced steps that you should follow, that you should keep in your mind while writing for translation, while preparing a document for translation, while writing the material that is going to be translated. Thank you for joining. Happy learning.